It was a cold, overcast morning in New York City, and Sarah Parker, a millionaire businesswoman and CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the world, was hurrying through Madison Square Park. The biting wind made her clutch her wool coat tighter, her mind fully occupied with the crucial meeting she was due to attend in a few minutes. Business was booming, but something felt off that morning, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Perhaps it was just the stress of yet another high-stakes negotiation. As she crossed the park, her thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a sound that seemed out of place in the busy, urban environment. It was the sound of a child crying, heart-wrenching, desperate. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the park until they locked onto the source of the sound. Sitting on a wooden bench, partially hidden by the trees, was a young boy, no older than 7 or 8, with dirty clothes and disheveled hair, sobbing as if the world had collapsed around him. Something inside Sarah cracked in that moment. She had never been the maternal type, and children had always seemed like foreign territory to her. But this boy, with his heartbreaking cries, stirred something deep within her. Against all logic and her usual instincts, she found herself slowly approaching him, careful not to startle him. "Hey, are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice softer than usual. The boy looked up, his big, tear-filled eyes meeting hers. There was a mixture of fear and sadness in his expression, something Sarah couldn't ignore. I'm lost," he replied between sobs. "I don't have anywhere to go." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She sat down beside him on the bench, completely forgetting about the important meeting that was likely starting without her. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Jason," he mumbled, wiping his eyes with his fist. "Where are your parents, Jason?" Sarah continued, feeling a chill run down her spine at the thought of what might have happened for such a young child to be alone in New York City. "I don't have parents. They died," Jason confessed, his voice trembling. "I was with my uncle, but he left me here. He said he'd be back, but it's been a long time, and he hasn't come back." Those words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She looked at little Jason, feeling a mix of compassion and outrage welling up inside her. How could someone abandon a child like this? Before she could think too much about it, she made a decision. "Jason, are you hungry?" she asked, trying to sound practical. The boy nodded, his eyes still brimming with tears, but with a faint glimmer of hope. Sarah stood up, extending her hand to him. "Come on, I know a place nearby where we can get something to eat. After that, we'll figure out what to do, okay?" Jason hesitated for a moment, but finally took Sarah's hand. There was something about this woman, the way she looked at him, that made him feel safe for the first time in days. Together, they left the park, unaware that this encounter would change both of their lives forever. What Sarah didn't know was that by taking Jason with her, she was about to uncover a secret that would shake her to her core, forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about her own life and family. Sarah led Jason to a cozy little cafe just a few blocks from the park. The warm interior was a welcome contrast to the chilly weather outside, and the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee and pastries filled the air. They sat down at a small table near the window, where Jason nervously glanced around, still holding onto Sarah's hand as if afraid she might disappear. A waitress approached, and Sarah ordered a sandwich and a hot chocolate for Jason, along with a coffee for herself. As they waited, Sarah watched Jason carefully, trying to piece together how this small boy had ended up alone in a city as overwhelming as New York. "So, Jason," she began gently, "how long were you with your uncle before he left you in the park?" Jason hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with a napkin on the table. "A few days, I think. We've been moving around a lot. He said we couldn't stay in one place for too long." The answer troubled Sarah. Why would a child be moved around so much? Something wasn't adding up, and the uneasy feeling in her chest grew stronger. "Did your uncle say where he was going?" "Maybe he got lost and couldn't find his way back," she suggested, trying to keep her voice hopeful. Jason shook his head. "No, he just said he had to go somewhere, and that I should stay in the park until he came back. But he never did." The waitress returned with their food, and Jason dug into his sandwich with a hunger that broke Sarah's heart. She watched him eat, her mind racing with questions. She needed to know more, but she didn't want to push him too hard. As Jason sipped his hot chocolate, Sarah decided to try a different approach. Jason, can you tell me a bit more about your family? You mentioned that your parents aren't around anymore. Jason paused, staring into his cup as if searching for the right words. My mom died when I was little. I don't remember her much. My dad, he left before I was born. I never knew him. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. And your uncle? Has he been taking care of you? Yeah, Jason said quietly. He's the only family I've got. But he's been acting strange lately, like he's scared of something. Scared of what? Sarah asked, leaning in slightly. I don't know, Jason admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He doesn't tell me much, but sometimes, when he thought I was asleep, I'd hear him talking on the phone. He'd say things about hiding and people looking for him. I didn't understand it. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Whoever Jason's uncle was, it was clear he was involved in something dangerous. The more Jason talked, the more certain Sarah became that this wasn't just a case of a lost boy. There was something much bigger going on. Jason, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, do you remember your uncle's name? Jason nodded. His name is Michael. Michael Williams. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The name rang a bell, but she couldn't place it immediately. Michael Williams. That sounds familiar, she murmured to herself, trying to recall where she'd heard it before. Jason looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Do you know him? Do you know where he is? Sarah didn't want to give him false hope, but she couldn't lie to him either. I'm not sure, Jason, but I'm going to find out. We'll figure this out together, okay? Jason nodded, a small flicker of trust returning to his eyes. Sarah knew she had to get to the bottom of this, but first, she needed more information. Jason, she asked, her voice steady, do you remember anything else about your uncle? Anything that might help us find him? Jason thought for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He gave me this before he left. He said I should keep it safe. Sarah unfolded the paper, her breath catching as she read the words written on it. It was an address, one she recognized all too well. It was an old family home she hadn't been to in years, a place tied to memories she had long since buried. The realization hit her like a freight train. Michael Williams wasn't just anyone. He was her brother, the brother she had lost contact with years ago and believed to be dead. Stunned, Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. The child sitting in front of her wasn't just a lost boy. He was her nephew, the son of her long-lost brother. Everything she thought she knew was about to unravel, and the truth was something she wasn't prepared for. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held the crumpled piece of paper, the address written on it glaring back at her like a ghost from the past. Her mind raced as she tried to process the shock of what she had just discovered. Michael Williams, her brother who she believed had died years ago, was alive. And not only that, he had a son sitting right in front of her. She forced herself to stay calm, not wanting to alarm Jason, who was still finishing his hot chocolate, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind. How could this be? She had been told Michael died in a car accident, a tragedy that had shattered her family and left her estranged from her remaining relatives. But if Michael had survived, why had he disappeared? And why hadn't he reached out to her? Her thoughts were interrupted by Jason's voice, breaking through the fog of confusion in her mind. Miss Sarah, are you okay? He asked, his small voice filled with concern as he noticed her distant expression. Sarah quickly composed herself, offering him a reassuring smile. I'm fine, Jason. Just thinking. She folded the paper and tucked it carefully into her coat pocket. There's something I need to tell you. Jason looked up at her with wide, expectant eyes. Sarah hesitated, struggling with how to break the news. How could she explain to this young boy that she was his aunt? That everything he had been through was tied to a family he never knew existed? Jason, she began slowly, choosing her words carefully. I think your Uncle Michael might be my brother. Jason blinked, confusion clouding his features. Your brother? But I don't understand. How come you didn't know? It's complicated, Sarah said gently, trying to ease his confusion. We lost touch a long time ago. I was told he died, but it seems there was a mistake. and I didn't know he was still alive. She paused, watching Jason closely as he processed this information. So, does that mean you're my aunt? Jason asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and a cautious hope. Yes, Sarah replied, feeling a surge of emotion she hadn't anticipated. It means we're family, Jason. Jason's face lit up with a mixture of relief and excitement, a small smile breaking through the fear that had clouded his expression. I have an aunt, he whispered, almost as if saying it out loud made it more real. Then, his smile faltered as another thought crossed his mind. But where's Uncle Michael? Why did he leave me? Sarah's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She wished she had the answers he needed, but she was just as lost as he was. I don't know yet, Jason, but I promise you, I'm going to find out. We're going to figure this out together. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah decided to take Jason back to the address on the paper, the old family home. If Michael had left it for Jason, it had to be important. Maybe there were clues there, something that could explain why Michael had disappeared and what had happened to him. Jason, she said, her voice firm but kind, we're going to take a little trip. There's a place we need to visit, and I think it might help us find your uncle. Jason nodded, his trust in Sarah growing stronger with each passing moment. They left the cafe, and Sarah hailed a cab, giving the driver the address she had thought she'd never visit again. As they drove through the city, memories of her childhood flooded back. Memories of Michael, of the close bond they once shared, and of the day everything fell apart. When they arrived at the old family home, Sarah felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with dread. The house was just as she remembered, weathered but sturdy, a relic of a past she had tried to forget. She paid the driver and led Jason up the cracked stone path to the front door. Standing on the doorstep, Sarah hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could feel Jason's nervous energy beside her, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. With a deep breath, she turned the knob, and the door creaked open, revealing a house frozen in time. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the soft light filtering through the curtains. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the air smelled of must and memories long buried. Sarah stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest as she took in the familiar surroundings. Every corner of the house held a memory, some sweet, others painful. Jason followed closely, his small hand clutching the edge of Sarah's coat. Is this where my uncle used to live? He asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. Yes, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. This was our family home. They walked through the house in silence, each step stirring up more questions. Sarah felt a strange sense of déjà vu as they made their way to the study, Michael's favorite room when they were kids. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah pushed it open, revealing a room that looked untouched by time. On the desk in the center of the room was a stack of papers, and something about the way they were arranged caught Sarah's attention. She approached the desk, her fingers brushing over the familiar items. A photo of her and Michael as children, a few letters, and a journal. She picked up the journal, her hands shaking slightly as she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable, Michael's. As she flipped through the pages, one entry stood out, written in a hurried scrawl. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong. I didn't want to drag you into this, but I had no choice. There are people after me, dangerous people. I had to disappear to keep you safe, to keep Jason safe. Trust no one. I'll come back for him as soon as I can. Until then, please protect him. He's all I have left. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she read the words, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. Michael hadn't abandoned Jason. He had been forced to leave him behind to protect him. But from what? And where was Michael now? She closed the journal, her resolve hardening. Whatever had happened to her brother, whatever danger he was in, she would find him. She would protect Jason, just as Michael had asked. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone she could trust, someone who could help her unravel the mystery that had torn her family apart. As she turned to Jason, she saw the fear and confusion in his eyes. She knelt down to his level, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jason, we're going to figure this out, but we need to be careful. There are people looking for your uncle, and we have to stay one step ahead of them. Jason nodded, his small face set with determination. I trust you, Aunt Sarah. We'll find him. Sarah smiled, though her heart was heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Together, they would uncover the truth. And no matter what it took, she would keep her promise to protect Jason, just as Michael had asked. The discovery of Michael's journal weighed heavily on Sarah's mind as she and Jason left the old family home. The chilling warning scribbled on its pages left no room for doubt. Michael was in serious trouble, and now, so were they. As they stepped back onto the cracked stone path, Sarah knew they couldn't stay at the house. It was too risky, too exposed. She needed to find a safe place where they could plan their next move. She hailed another cab, giving the driver the address of a luxury hotel she often used for business trips. It was discreet, secure, and far removed from the memories of her past. As the cab weaved through the bustling streets of New York, Sarah felt a growing sense of urgency. Whoever was after Michael wouldn't hesitate to come after Jason if they realized who he was. The hotel lobby was quiet, its polished marble floors and elegant chandeliers offering a stark contrast to the turmoil in Sarah's mind. She checked them in under a different name, using her business connections to ensure their stay would be untraceable. As they entered the suite, Jason's eyes widened at the lavish surroundings, but Sarah could see the worry still etched on his face. Aunt Sarah, Jason began, his voice small. What do we do now? How are we going to find my uncle? Sarah knelt in front of him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. First, we need to stay safe. That's the most important thing. We'll figure out where your uncle is, but we have to be careful. Whoever is after him might come looking for us too. Jason nodded, his trust in Sarah evident despite the fear in his eyes. Okay, I'll do whatever you say. Sarah's heart ached at his bravery, but she knew they were walking a dangerous line. She needed to gather information, fast. Pulling out her phone, she made a series of calls, reaching out to her most trusted contacts, people she knew from her years in the business world who had access to resources far beyond the norm. If anyone could help her track down Michael and understand what kind of trouble he was in, it was them. The first call she made was to David Carlisle, a private investigator she had worked with on several sensitive corporate matters. He was discreet, thorough, and knew how to dig deep without raising suspicions. David, it's Sarah Parker, she said when he answered, keeping her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her. I need your help. This is a personal matter, highly confidential. David didn't hesitate. Anything you need, Sarah. What's going on? Sarah took a deep breath and explained the situation as concisely as possible. Michael's disappearance, Jason's abandonment, and the cryptic message in the journal. She left out no details, knowing that David needed the full picture to understand the gravity of the situation. David was silent for a moment after she finished. Then his voice came through, calm and professional. This is serious, Sarah. If your brother was mixed up with dangerous people, we need to tread carefully. I'll start looking into Michael's last known whereabouts, but you need to stay off the radar. No contact with anyone who might be able to trace you. Understood, Sarah replied. I'm staying at a hotel under an alias. No one knows we're here. Good, David said. I'll get back to you as soon as I have something. And Sarah, be careful. Sarah ended the call, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. David was the best in the business, but she knew even he had his limits. Whoever was after Michael, they were powerful enough to make him disappear without a trace. Hours passed as they waited in the hotel room, the tension thick in the air. Jason tried to distract himself by watching TV, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes every time he glanced in her direction. She kept busy, checking her phone constantly, hoping for an update from David. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each one filled with the weight of uncertainty. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from David. Found something? Call me. She dialed his number immediately, her heart pounding in her chest. David answered on the first ring. Sarah, I've got some news, but it's not good, he said, his tone grave. What did you find? Sarah asked, bracing herself for the worst. Michael's been off the grid for a while, but I traced some of his movements to a safe house in the Bronx. It's an old building, mostly abandoned. He's been using it as a hideout, but here's the thing. There's been activity around the place recently. I'm talking about surveillance, people watching the building. Whoever's after him knows where he is, or at least where he was. Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. Is he still there? I can't say for sure, David admitted. It's too risky to send someone in without drawing attention. But if I had to guess, he's either gone or lying low somewhere close by. If you're thinking about going there, Sarah, you need to be extremely careful. These aren't the kind of people you want to cross. I don't have a choice, Sarah said, her voice firm. I need to find him before they do. Can you give me the address? David hesitated, then relented. I'll send it to you, but Sarah, promise me you'll be careful. Take backup if you can. I will, Sarah assured him, though she knew the only backup she had was her own determination. Thank you, David. I owe you. Just stay safe, Sarah, David said before hanging up. Sarah received the address in a text moments later. She stared at the screen. The location seared into her mind. She had to go. There was no other option. But she couldn't take Jason with her. It was too dangerous. Jason, she said, turning to him, I need you to stay here for a little while. I'm going to check on something, and it's not safe for you to come with me. Jason's face fell, but he nodded. Okay, but you'll come back, right? Sarah knelt down to his level, looking him in the eyes. I promise, I'll come back. I'm going to find your uncle and bring him back too. Just stay here, keep the door locked, and don't answer it for anyone but me. Jason hugged her tightly, and Sarah felt a surge of protectiveness. She couldn't fail him. Not now, not ever. After making sure Jason was secure in the hotel room, Sarah left, her mind focused on the dangerous task ahead. She hailed another cab and gave the driver the address David had sent her. As the car wound through the darkening streets of New York, Sarah's thoughts raced. She had no idea what she would find at the safe house, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't leave without answers. The cab pulled up to the address, and Sarah stepped out, her heart pounding as she surveyed the area. The building was old, its facade crumbling, and the windows were boarded up. It looked deserted, but she knew better. Taking a deep breath, she approached the entrance, every sense on high alert. As she pushed the door open, a creak echoed through the empty hallway. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deeper within. Sarah moved cautiously, her footsteps silent as she made her way through the dilapidated building. She reached a door at the end of the hallway, its paint peeling and worn. Taking another deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, but she could make out a figure slumped in a chair, hands bound, head hanging low. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she rushed forward, her breath catching in her throat. "Michael," she whispered, praying she wasn't too late. The figure stirred, lifting his head slightly. "Sarah," the voice was weak, but unmistakable. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as she saw her brother's face, battered but alive. She quickly untied the ropes binding him, her hands shaking with a mix of relief and fear. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently, helping him to his feet. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Sarah's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the dilapidated building like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something inevitable. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she supported Michael, his weight heavy against her as they hurried to find an escape route. But the building was a maze of decaying walls and boarded-up windows, with every creak of the floorboards threatening to give them away. "Michael, can you walk on your own?" Sarah whispered urgently, her voice tight with fear. Michael nodded weakly, but she could see the strain on his face. He was exhausted, his body battered from whatever ordeal he had endured. Still, he pushed himself to move, knowing they didn't have much time. As they reached the end of a narrow corridor, Sarah spotted a small, grimy window that hadn't been completely boarded up. It was their only chance. She helped Michael toward it, quickly assessing the drop to the ground outside. It wasn't far, maybe 10 feet, but in his condition, it could be dangerous. "We need to go out through here," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll go first and help you down." Michael didn't argue. He was too weak to protest, and he knew Sarah was right. She squeezed through the small opening, landing softly on the ground outside. The air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the stifling tension inside the building. She looked up, motioning for Michael to follow. He struggled to maneuver through the window, his movements slow and labored. As he dangled from the ledge, Sarah reached up, grabbing hold of him and helping him down. They both landed with a thud, and Sarah quickly steadied her brother, looking around to make sure they hadn't been spotted. But as they turned to make their escape, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the man standing before them. A face she hadn't seen in years, but one she would never forget. "David," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. David Carlyle, the private investigator she had trusted, stood before them, his expression unreadable. The same man she had called for help, the same man who had guided her to this very location, now stood between them and freedom. There was something cold in his eyes, something Sarah had never seen before. "Sarah, I'm sorry," David said, his voice calm but firm, "but you shouldn't have come here. You're in over your head." Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. "You led me here," she accused, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and betrayal. "You told me to find Michael." David sighed, a look of regret passing over his face. "I didn't have a choice. They found out I was looking into Michael, and they forced my hand. It was either lead you here or let them find Jason." Sarah's blood ran cold at the mention of Jason. "You put my nephew in danger," she asked, her voice rising with fury. "I did what I had to do to keep you both alive," David shot back, his tone hardening. "These people aren't playing games, Sarah. They wanted Michael, and they'll do whatever it takes to get him." Michael, leaning heavily on Sarah, spoke up, his voice rough and pained. "David, who are they? What do they want?" David hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "It's complicated," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Michael, you were involved in something big, bigger than you knew. You got too close to something, and now they want to silence you." "What did I get close to?" Michael asked, desperation creeping into his voice. David shook his head. "I don't know all the details, but I know it involves high-level corruption, powerful people who can't afford to be exposed. You stumbled onto something, and they've been after you ever since. They thought you were dead, but when they found out you were still alive, they came after you with everything they had." Sarah felt a wave of fear and anger surge through her. "You should have told me, David. We could have found another way." "There was no other way," David said, his voice harsh. "I'm trying to protect you, Sarah, but now you need to leave, both of you. Get out of the city, go somewhere safe. I'll do what I can to keep them off your trail." But Sarah wasn't ready to back down. "And what about you, David? Whose side are you really on?" David's eyes softened, and for a moment, she saw a glimpse of the man she thought she knew. "I'm on your side, Sarah. I always have been, but I'm also trying to keep myself alive. I can't fight them alone." "Then help us," Sarah pleaded. "We can do this together." Before David could respond, the sound of more footsteps echoed through the alley, closer and more urgent. Panic seized Sarah as she realized they were running out of time. "Go," David urged, stepping aside to clear their path. "I'll hold them off. You need to disappear now." Michael grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the darkness at the edge of the alley. She hesitated for a split second, locking eyes with David one last time. There was no telling if she could trust him, but right now, they had no choice. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the twisted reality they found themselves in, before turning to run with Michael. As they fled into the night, Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and survival. She had no idea where they were going, or who they could trust anymore. But one thing was clear: they couldn't do this alone. They needed allies, people who weren't compromised, people they could trust with their lives. But in a world where alliances could shift in an instant, and where the line between friend and enemy was blurred beyond recognition, finding those allies would be the hardest task of all. The dark streets of New York blurred as Sarah and Michael ran, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding in their chests. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant sound like the footsteps of the people hunting them. They needed to find safety, But in a city that suddenly seemed so hostile, Sarah wasn't sure where that could be. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a quiet side street. The area was unfamiliar to Sarah, but that was a good thing. It meant it might also be unfamiliar to whoever was after them. Michael was struggling, his strength fading with each step, and Sarah knew they couldn't keep running much longer. "We need to stop," she said, her voice low but firm. She scanned the area, her eyes landing on a small, nondescript motel a block away. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, the kind of place where they could lie low for a few hours. Michael nodded weakly, his face pale and drawn. I can't go much further," he admitted, his voice hoarse. Sarah guided him to the motel, her senses on high alert. She paid in cash, using a false name, and they slipped into the small, dingy room as quietly as they could. The room was far from luxurious, but right now, all that mattered was that it had 4 walls and a lock on the door. Michael collapsed onto the bed, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. Sarah quickly checked the room, ensuring the windows were secure and that there was no way anyone could get in without them knowing. Once she was satisfied that they were as safe as they could be, she turned her attention back to her brother. His condition was worse than she had realized. He was barely conscious, his breaths shallow and labored. Panic surged through her. He needed medical attention, but taking him to a hospital was too risky. She had no idea who could be watching, who might be waiting for them to make that very move. "Michael, stay with me," Sarah urged, sitting beside him on the bed. She placed a hand on his forehead, feeling the fever burning through him. "You need help, but we can't go to a hospital. There has to be another way." Michael's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. "There's a friend," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Phillips, in Brooklyn. He can help without questions." Sarah nodded, desperately clinging to this small shred of hope. "Okay, I'll get him here. Just hold on, Michael." She found the motel's phone and quickly dialed the number Michael had given her. The phone rang several times before a gruff voice answered. "Dr. Phillips," the voice said, wary and guarded. "Dr. Phillips, my name is Sarah. I'm with Michael Williams. He's in trouble, and he needs your help," she said quickly, praying the doctor would remember Michael and be willing to assist. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the doctor spoke again, his tone more urgent. "Where are you?" Sarah gave him the address of the motel, and the doctor promised to be there as soon as possible. She hung up, her heart racing as she returned to Michael's side. "Help is coming," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Just hold on a little longer." Minutes felt like hours as they waited in the cramped room, every sound outside sending a jolt of fear through Sarah. She was acutely aware of how vulnerable they were, how exposed. If anyone found them now, they wouldn't stand a chance. Finally, there was a soft knock at the door. Sarah tensed, her hand hovering over the small lamp on the bedside table, the only potential weapon she had. "Who is it?" she called, her voice steely. "Dr. Phillips," came the response. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then opened the door just enough to see the man standing outside. He was older, with graying hair and a worn expression, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. Dr. Phillips moved quickly, his gaze immediately assessing Michael's condition. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice all business. "He's in bad shape, but I can stabilize him here." Sarah watched anxiously as the doctor set to work, pulling out a small medical kit from his bag. He administered a series of injections and set up in 4 drip, his hands steady and sure. Michael's breathing began to even out, and some of the color returned to his face. Relief washed over Sarah, but it was short-lived. As Dr. Phillips worked, he began asking questions, his tone careful. "Michael told me he was in trouble, but he didn't say how deep," Dr. Phillips said, glancing at Sarah. "What are you two involved in?" Sarah hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "I don't know all the details," she admitted. "But Michael got caught up in something dangerous, something involving powerful people. They want him dead, and now they're after us too." Dr. Phillips nodded, his expression grim. "That explains the state he's in. He's been running for a long time." Sarah swallowed hard. "Can you keep him safe? Can you help us? The doctor paused, considering her words carefully. I can keep him stable for now, but you need to move him somewhere more secure. This place won't hold for long. Sarah's heart sank. She knew he was right, but the thought of moving Michael again, especially in his condition, filled her with dread. Where can we go? There's a safe house, Dr. Phillips said, his voice low. It's not far, and it's off the grid. You'll be safe there, at least for a little while. I'll arrange for transportation. Sarah nodded, grateful but still anxious. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. I don't know how to repay you. Just keep Michael safe, the doctor replied, his tone softening slightly. He's a good man, and he's been through hell. He deserves a chance. As Dr. Phillips made arrangements, Sarah's thoughts drifted to Jason. She had promised to return to him, to keep him safe, but now everything felt more precarious than ever. She couldn't bring Jason to the safe house. It was too risky. But leaving him alone in the hotel wasn't an option either. She reached for her phone, dialing the number of the only person she could trust with Jason's safety. Her assistant, Claire. Claire had been with Sarah for years, loyal and discreet, and most importantly, she had no connection to the dangerous world Michael had stumbled into. Claire, it's Sarah, she said when her assistant answered. I need your help. It's urgent. Of course, Sarah. What do you need? Claire's voice was calm and professional, just what Sarah needed to hear. I'm sending you an address. There's a boy there, Jason. I need you to go to him and keep him safe. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't let him out of your sight. Can you do that? Absolutely, Claire replied without hesitation. I'm on my way. Sarah hung up, feeling a small measure of relief. Jason was in good hands. Now, she had to focus on getting Michael to safety and finding a way out of this nightmare. The transportation Dr. Phillips had arranged arrived quickly, a nondescript van driven by a man who didn't ask any questions. They carefully loaded Michael into the back, and Sarah climbed in beside him, her nerves on edge. As the van pulled away from the motel, Sarah glanced out the window, her thoughts racing. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty and danger, but there was no turning back now. She had to protect her brother, her nephew, and herself. The stakes were higher than ever, and the threats against her family were closing in. But Sarah Parker wasn't one to back down. She would face whatever came next with the same determination that had brought her this far. And she would find a way to keep her family safe, no matter the cost. The van rumbled through the quiet streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it carried Sarah and Michael toward the safe house. The tension in the air was palpable, every bump in the road jolting Sarah's nerves. Michael lay beside her, still pale and weak, but his breathing had stabilized thanks to Dr. Phillips' intervention. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. They were playing a dangerous game, and the enemy was closing in. The safe house, when they finally arrived, was tucked away in a secluded part of the city, a nondescript building surrounded by trees, with no sign that anyone lived there. The driver pulled up to the back entrance, and Sarah helped Michael out of the van, her heart pounding as she scanned the area for any signs of danger. The inside of the safe house was sparse but secure. Thick walls, reinforced doors, and a comprehensive security system designed to keep intruders out. It wasn't luxurious, but it offered something far more valuable: protection. Dr. Phillips had stayed behind at the motel to avoid drawing attention to the safe house, but he had given Sarah instructions on how to care for Michael and assured her that help would be nearby if needed. As Sarah helped Michael to the bed in the small, sterile room, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. They were safe for now, but she knew it wouldn't last. The people hunting them were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they found this place too. Michael's eyes fluttered open as she adjusted the blankets around him. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice weak but insistent. "You need to know, they're not just coming after me. They want everything. Everything our family built." Sarah frowned, leaning closer to catch his words. "What do you mean? Who are they?" Michael's hand trembled as he reached for hers. "Powerful people. They're involved in everything. Politics, business, even the law. They've been manipulating things behind the scenes for years. When I found out, they couldn't risk letting me live." Sarah's heart raced as she absorbed his words. "What did you find, Michael? What's so dangerous that they'd come after you like this?" Michael coughed, his breath hitching. It's a conspiracy, Sarah. They've been laundering money, bribing officials, controlling markets, and it all leads back to some of the most influential people in the country. I stumbled onto something big when I was looking into some old family business deals. That's when they came after me. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known her family was powerful, but this was something else entirely. Do you have proof? Anything we can use to stop them? Michael nodded weakly. I hid the evidence. It's all there. Documents, recordings, everything. But you have to be careful. They've got eyes everywhere. People we thought we could trust, they're in on it too. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. If she could get her hands on that evidence, she could expose the conspiracy and bring down the people who were hunting them. But it would mean going up against some of the most dangerous people in the country, people who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Where is it, Michael? Where did you hide the evidence? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Michael struggled to sit up, his face contorted with pain. There's a storage unit under a different name. It's in the East Village. You'll find everything there. But Sarah, you can't do this alone. You need help. Someone you can trust. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. She couldn't take on something this big by herself. But who could she trust? David had already shown that he was compromised, and Claire, though loyal, wasn't equipped to handle something of this magnitude. As she pondered her next move, her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out and saw a message from Claire. Jason is safe. We're laying low, just like you asked. Call me when you can. Relief washed over her at the thought of Jason being safe, but it was quickly overshadowed by the reality of their situation. She needed to act fast, and she needed to find someone who could help her navigate the dangerous waters ahead. Then, a thought struck her, a name she hadn't considered before, but someone who might have the resources and connections to help her. A man she had crossed paths with years ago in the business world. Someone who operated in the shadows but had a reputation for getting things done. His name was Victor Russo, a powerful figure in the underworld, known for his intelligence and ruthlessness. He wasn't someone Sarah would have ever considered approaching under normal circumstances, but this was far from normal. Victor owed her a favor, one she had never called in. If there was ever a time to cash in on that debt, it was now. She dialed Victor's number, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed the phone to her ear. It rang twice before a smooth, deep voice answered. Sarah Parker, Victor said, his tone calm and measured. To what do I owe the pleasure? Victor, Sarah began, her voice steady but urgent. I need your help. It's about my brother, Michael. He's in serious trouble, and so am I. There's a conspiracy. Big, powerful people are involved, and they're coming after us. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Victor's voice returned, cool and calculating. This sounds serious, Sarah, and dangerous. What exactly do you need from me? I need protection, Victor, and I need help getting my hands on some evidence that could bring these people down. If I can expose them, we might stand a chance. Victor was silent for a moment. Then he let out a low chuckle. You've always been ambitious, Sarah, but going up against these kinds of people, that's a risky move. I don't have a choice, Sarah replied, her voice firm. They've already tried to kill my brother, and they won't stop until they've destroyed everything. I need your help, Victor. Please. Another pause, then Victor sighed. All right, Sarah, I'll help you. But understand this, once you're in, there's no turning back. You'll owe me, and I always collect my debts. Sarah swallowed hard, knowing the gravity of what she was agreeing to, but she had no other options. I understand. Thank you, Victor. I'll send someone to get you and your brother, Victor said. You'll be safe with me. And Sarah, be careful. The people you're dealing with don't play by the rules. The line went dead, and Sarah pocketed her phone, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She had taken the first step towards shifting the balance of power, but she knew it came with a price. Victor Russo was not a man to be trifled with, and involving him meant entering a world where alliances could be as deadly as enemies. But right now, all that mattered was keeping her family safe. If it meant making a deal with the devil, then so be it. She would do whatever it took to protect the people she loved, even if it meant stepping into the darkness herself. As Sarah waited for Victor's men to arrive, she looked over at Michael, who had drifted back into a restless sleep. The weight of what she was about to do settled heavily on her shoulders, but she knew there was no other way. They were out of time, and the power dynamics had shifted. Now, it was up to her to take control and steer them through the storm ahead. The safe house was eerily silent as Sarah waited, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. Every minute felt like an eternity as she sat by Michael's side, her mind racing with the implications of the deal she had just made with Victor Russo. She knew it was a gamble, one that could cost her everything, but she was out of options. The only way forward was to confront the people who had turned her life upside down. The sound of a car pulling up outside snapped Sarah out of her thoughts. She moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A sleek, black SUV was parked in the shadows, and two men in dark suits emerged, their movements precise and purposeful. These were Victor's men, professionals, the kind who didn't ask questions. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she moved back to the bed where Michael lay. "Michael, we have to go," she whispered, gently shaking him awake. Michael stirred, his eyes blinking open as he tried to focus. He was still weak, but the urgency in Sarah's voice spurred him into action. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We're going to meet with Victor Russo. He's going to help us," Sarah replied, trying to sound confident despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. Michael's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Victor's name. He knew as well as Sarah did what kind of man Victor was, but there was no time to argue. He nodded, trusting his sister's judgment. Sarah helped Michael to his feet, and they made their way to the door. The men outside were waiting, their expressions unreadable as they escorted Sarah and Michael to the SUV. The drive through the darkened streets of New York was tense and silent, the city passing by in a blur as they headed toward an unknown destination. After what felt like an hour, the SUV pulled up to a large, secluded building on the outskirts of the city. It was an imposing structure with tall, iron gates and a high wall surrounding it. The kind of place where secrets were kept and where deals were made in the shadows. The men led Sarah and Michael inside, where they were met by Victor himself. He was as imposing as Sarah remembered, tall, with a sharp, calculating gaze that seemed to see through everything. He was impeccably dressed, his appearance exuding power and control. "Sarah, Michael," Victor greeted them, his voice smooth and measured. "I'm glad you made it safely." Sarah nodded, trying to hide the unease that threatened to overwhelm her. "Thank you for helping us, Victor. I know this isn't easy." Victor waved a hand dismissively. "Consider it a favor for an old friend, but let's not waste time. We have work to do." He gestured for them to follow him deeper into the building, where the atmosphere grew colder, more oppressive. They were led into a large, dimly lit room with a long table at its center. On the table were several folders, a laptop, and a few other items that Sarah couldn't quite make out. Victor took a seat at the head of the table, motioning for Sarah and Michael to sit as well. "This is where we make our move," Victor began, his tone businesslike. "You've got the evidence, and I've got the means to get it where it needs to go. But first, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Michael, still pale and weak, leaned forward, his voice strained but determined. "It's all in a storage unit in the East Village. Everything you need, documents, recordings, names. It's enough to bring them down." Victor's eyes gleamed with interest. "Good. We'll retrieve it, but we have to be careful. The people you're up against won't go down without a fight. They've got eyes everywhere, and they won't hesitate to kill anyone who stands in their way." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "So what do we do?" Victor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he spoke. "We play their game, but on our terms. We'll use the evidence to force them into a corner, to expose them. But we need to be smart about it. One wrong move, and it's over." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. "Whatever it takes, we'll bring them down." Victor gave a small, approving nod. "That's the spirit. I've already set things in motion. My men will retrieve the evidence, and we'll arrange a meeting with the key players. We'll give them a choice, back down, or be exposed." Michael's face tightened with determination. "And if they refuse?" Victor's expression darkened. "Then we'll make sure they don't get another chance." The gravity of the situation settled over them like a heavy fog. They were about to go up against some of the most powerful people in the country, people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened their control. But Sarah knew there was no turning back. They had come too far, and too much was at stake. Over the next few hours, Victor's men worked quickly and efficiently, retrieving the evidence from the storage unit and preparing for the confrontation. Sarah stayed close to Michael, offering what support she could while keeping her own fear in check. She knew that what they were about to do could change everything, for better or for worse. As the final preparations were made, Victor turned to Sarah, his gaze sharp and focused. "It's time. Are you ready?" Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Yes, let's do this." Victor's men escorted them to another vehicle, a sleek black car that would take them to the location where the confrontation would take place. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they drove through the city, the tension building with every passing moment. This was it, the moment where everything would be decided. The car pulled up to a tall, glass building in the heart of the city, a symbol of power and wealth. They entered through a private side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where cameras and security were stationed. Victor led the way, his presence commanding as they made their way to a private conference room on the top floor. Inside the room, several men were already waiting. Men who exuded the same aura of power and control that Victor did. They were the key players, the ones who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Their expressions were cold and calculating as they sized up Sarah and Michael, clearly aware of the stakes. Victor took his place at the head of the table, his demeanor confident and unyielding. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. We have some important matters to discuss." One of the men, older and with a stern face, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What is this about, Russo? Why are we here?" Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're here because it's time for a change. The game you've been playing, manipulating markets, bribing officials, laundering money, it's over. We have the evidence to expose everything." The room fell silent, the tension crackling like electricity. The men exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. "You think you can threaten us, Russo?" Another man growled, his tone laced with anger. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Victor remained unfazed, his smile never wavering. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and that's why I'm giving you a choice. You can walk away, quietly, with your reputations intact, or you can go down in flames. It's up to you." Sarah watched the exchange, her heart in her throat. This was the moment of truth, the moment where everything would be decided. She could see the fear in the men's eyes, masked by their bravado, but she knew they were cornered. They had never expected anyone to challenge them like this, and now they were scrambling to figure out how to save themselves. The older man's gaze shifted to Sarah and Michael, his eyes narrowing. "And what about them? What do they get out of this?" Victor's smile faded, replaced by a cold, steely gaze. "They get justice, and if you try to stop them, you'll be the ones who pay the price." The tension in the room reached a boiling point as the men exchanged glances, their minds racing. They knew they were outmatched, that the evidence Victor had was enough to destroy them. But they were also dangerous, desperate men who wouldn't go down without a fight. Finally, the older man leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "All right, Russo, you've made your point, but don't think for a second that this is over. We'll be watching. And if you step out of line—" Victor cut him off, his voice ice cold. "If you so much as breathe wrong, I'll bury you. This is your last chance. Take it, or walk away with nothing." Victor turned to Sarah and Michael, his expression unreadable as the door closed behind the last of the men. The room was heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation, the tension slowly giving way to a tentative sense of victory. But Sarah knew better than to let her guard down just yet. "You did well," Victor said, his voice smooth but laced with caution. "But this is just the beginning. Those men may have backed down today, but they won't stay quiet for long. They'll regroup, find new ways to come after you, and they'll do it with even more determination." Sarah nodded, fully aware of the implications. "We expected that, but now, at least, we have a fighting chance. We've taken the first step." Victor's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if assessing her resolve. Then he turned to Michael, who was still pale but more alert after the adrenaline of the confrontation. "You're lucky to have a sister like Sarah," Victor remarked. "Few people would go to such lengths. But you need to be smart now. Keep your head down, and don't make any moves without a plan." Michael nodded, his voice hoarse but determined. "I understand. I won't let them take anything else from us." Victor seemed satisfied with that response. He glanced at his watch, then back at Sarah. "I'll arrange for a secure location where you can both lay low for a while. It's important that you disappear, at least until the dust settles. I'll have my people keep an eye on those men. Make sure they don't try anything in the meantime." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude, though it was tempered by the awareness of what she now owed Victor. "Thank you, Victor. I won't forget this." Victor's expression softened slightly, a rare moment of sincerity breaking through his usual stoicism. "Just remember what I said. When the time comes, I'll collect on this favor. But for now, focus on keeping your family safe." With that, Victor turned and signaled to one of his men, who immediately left the room to make the necessary arrangements. Sarah watched him go, the weight of the day finally settling on her shoulders. The confrontation had gone as well as they could have hoped, but the reality of their situation was far from resolved. As they waited, Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features. "Sarah, I'm sorry I dragged you into this," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "I never wanted you to get hurt because of my mistakes." Sarah reached over, taking his hand in hers. "You didn't drag me into anything, Michael. We're family, and that means we face this together, no matter what." Michael gave her a tired smile, a flicker of the brother she remembered shining through. "I don't know how you stayed so strong through all of this, but I'm glad you did." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened again, and Victor's man returned. "The safe house is ready. We can leave whenever you're ready." Sarah stood, helping Michael to his feet. As they prepared to leave, Victor walked them to the door, his presence as commanding as ever. "You'll be safe where you're going," he assured them. "But remember, don't reach out to anyone. No phone calls, no emails. Stay off the grid." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We will." "Thank you, Victor." With one last look at Victor, Sarah and Michael followed the man out of the building and into the waiting car. The drive was quiet, the streets now dark and mostly deserted as they made their way to the new safe house. The city that had once felt so familiar now seemed like a distant, dangerous place. When they finally arrived, the safe house was even more secluded than the last, a small, unassuming cabin nestled in a wooded area far from the city. It was the kind of place where no one would think to look, the kind of place that offered the anonymity they so desperately needed. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, with just enough amenities to get by. Michael sank onto the couch, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building for days. Sarah sat beside him, her mind still racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. For the first time in what felt like days, the weight of the situation began to lift, if only slightly. They were safe, at least for now, and they had struck a blow against the people who had tried to destroy them. But the fight was far from over. As Sarah sat in the quiet of the cabin, she realized that their lives would never be the same. They had crossed a line, entered a world where power and corruption ruled, and there was no turning back. But as long as they had each other, they would find a way to survive. They had to. And so, as the night wore on, Sarah made a silent vow. She would protect her brother, her nephew, and herself, no matter what it took. She had faced the enemy, stared them down, and come out alive. Now, it was time to rebuild, to find a way to not just survive, but to fight back. Because as long as they were still standing, the battle was far from over. The days at the secluded safe house blurred into one another, marked by a tense quiet that hovered over Sarah and Michael like a heavy fog. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it gave them time to heal and regroup, but on the other, it left them alone with their thoughts, with the knowledge that the world outside was still waiting to close in on them. Michael had begun to regain some of his strength, though he was far from fully recovered. Sarah kept a close eye on him, but she knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. The confrontation with the powerful men they had faced might have bought them some time, but it was clear that they would need to make a more decisive move to secure their future. One morning, as the sun filtered through the trees surrounding the cabin, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, going over the evidence Michael had hidden away. The documents were damning, proof of corruption at the highest levels, of crimes that had been covered up for years. There were names, bank transactions, and even recordings of conversations that implicated powerful figures. It was enough to bring down empires. But the more she looked at it, the more Sarah realized that they couldn't do this alone. The conspiracy they were up against was too vast, too deeply rooted in the fabric of society. They needed someone with the power and the will to take this evidence and use it to bring about real change. Someone they could trust. The idea had been forming in Sarah's mind for days, but it wasn't until she sat there, surrounded by the weight of the evidence, that she knew what she had to do. There was one person who might be able to help them, someone who had the resources and the reach to make this matter on a national level. Senator Evelyn Grant, a politician known for her integrity and her willingness to stand up against corruption. It was a risk, reaching out to someone so high-profile, but Sarah felt they had no choice. Senator Grant was one of the few people in power who hadn't been tainted by the very corruption they were trying to expose. If anyone could take this evidence and use it to bring down the conspirators, it was her. Sarah stood, her resolve hardening as she crossed the room to where Michael was resting on the couch. "Michael," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, "I think I know what we need to do next." Michael opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. "What is it?" "We need to take this evidence to Senator Evelyn Grant," Sarah said, her voice steady. "She's the only one who can use it to bring down the people who've been hunting us. She's clean, and she's been fighting corruption for years. If we give this to her, she can make sure it gets the attention it deserves." Michael considered her words, a look of cautious hope crossing his face. "But how do we get to her? She's a public figure. If we try to approach her directly, we could be exposing ourselves." Sarah had thought about that too. "We'll have to be careful, but I think we can do it. Victor still has people keeping an eye on those men. We can use that to our advantage. We can arrange a meeting with Senator Grant in a secure location, somewhere they won't expect. And we'll need to make sure she understands the gravity of what we're giving her." Michael nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it might be our only shot. If we can get her on our side, we can bring them down," Sarah finished, the determination in her voice unmistakable. "We've come too far to stop now." The decision made, Sarah reached out to Victor, explaining their plan. He listened carefully, his silence unnerving as always, but in the end, he agreed to help. It was clear that he had his own reasons for wanting to see this through. Perhaps his own vendetta against the same people who had targeted Sarah and Michael. Whatever his motivations, Sarah knew they needed his resources to make this work. Victor arranged for a secure meeting with Senator Grant, using his contacts to ensure it would be away from prying eyes. The location was a private estate outside the city, owned by one of Victor's many associates, a place where they could speak freely and where security would be ironclad. The day of the meeting arrived, and Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. This was the moment they had been working toward, the chance to finally put an end to the nightmare that had consumed their lives. But with it came the fear that something could go wrong, that they could be walking into a trap, or worse, that Senator Grant might not be able to help after all. They traveled to the estate under the cover of darkness, the journey tense and silent. Michael was beside her in the back seat, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window. Sarah knew he was thinking about everything they had been through, about the danger they were still in. But there was also a sense of purpose in his eyes, a determination that matched her own. When they arrived, the estate was as secluded as Victor had promised. The gates were guarded, and as they were escorted inside, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was it, the moment of truth. Senator Grant was already waiting for them in a large, wood-paneled study, her presence commanding and confident. She stood as they entered, her sharp blue eyes appraising them with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Miss Parker, Mr. Williams," she greeted them, her voice clear and steady. "I understand you have something important to discuss." Sarah stepped forward, clutching the briefcase that held the evidence. "Thank you for meeting with us, Senator. We wouldn't have come to you if it wasn't a matter of life and death. What we're about to show you, It's going to change everything." Senator Grant gestured for them to sit, her expression serious. "I've been informed of the situation, but I need to see it for myself. Show me what you have." With a deep breath, Sarah opened the briefcase and began laying out the documents, the recordings, everything they had gathered. As she did, she explained the story, how Michael had uncovered the conspiracy, how they had been hunted, and how they had barely escaped with their lives. She left nothing out, knowing that Senator Grant needed to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. The senator listened intently, her gaze never leaving the evidence in front of her. As Sarah finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Senator Grant's face was grave, the enormity of what she had just seen clear in her eyes. "This is beyond anything I've encountered," Senator Grant finally said, her voice hushed with the weight of it. "If what you're saying is true, this goes to the very heart of our government, our institutions. The people involved, they have the power to destroy anyone who gets in their way." Sarah nodded, her voice firm. "That's why we need your help. We can't do this alone. But with you, we have a chance to expose them, to bring them to justice." Senator Grant sat back, her mind clearly racing as she processed everything. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "I'll help you, but we have to be extremely careful. This kind of operation, it could bring the entire system crashing down. There will be resistance, people who will stop at nothing to protect themselves." "We're ready for that," Michael said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "We've already lost everything because of these people. We have nothing left to lose." Senator Grant gave him a long, appraising look, then nodded again. "All right, we'll need to move quickly. I'll start by taking this to the highest authorities I can trust. We'll initiate a covert investigation, but we'll need to keep it quiet until we're ready to strike. Any leak could jeopardize everything." Sarah felt a surge of hope. Finally, they had someone on their side with the power to make a difference. But she knew the road ahead would be treacherous. They were about to take on some of the most dangerous people in the country, and there was no guarantee they would come out unscathed. As the meeting came to a close, Senator Grant stood, her demeanor as resolute as ever. "I'll be in touch as soon as we have a plan in place. In the meantime, you both need to stay hidden. If they find out you're still alive, they won't hesitate to strike again." Sarah and Michael nodded, their trust in Senator Grant solidified. As they left the estate and headed back to the safe house, there was a sense of renewed purpose between them. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting back, and they had the means to do it. But as they settled in for the night, the weight of what they were about to undertake loomed large. The fight for justice was just beginning, and they knew that the final battle would be the hardest yet. The days following their meeting with Senator Grant were a blur of tension and waiting. Sarah and Michael remained hidden in the safe house, isolated from the world as they anxiously awaited word from the senator. Every knock on the door, every unexpected sound, sent their hearts racing, but they knew there was no turning back. They had placed their trust in Senator Grant, and now all they could do was hope that she would deliver on her promise. Then, one morning, the call came. Sarah's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered, her voice steady despite the nerves that churned in her stomach. "This is Sarah." "Sarah, it's Senator Grant." The senator's voice was calm but urgent. "We're ready to move forward, but we need to act quickly. Can you meet me at the location we discussed?" "Yes, we'll be there," Sarah replied without hesitation. She ended the call and turned to Michael, who was already gathering his things. "It's time." They left the safe house under the cover of darkness, traveling in an unmarked car provided by Victor's men. The destination was a secure government building in the heart of the city, a place where they could finally put an end to the nightmare that had consumed their lives. When they arrived, Senator Grant was waiting for them, her presence as commanding as ever. She led them through a series of security checks and into a large, windowless room where a group of serious-looking men and women were gathered around a table. Sarah recognized some of them. High-ranking officials, federal agents, people with the power to bring about real change. The air in the room was thick with tension as Senator Grant introduced Sarah and Michael, laying out the details of the case they had brought to her. The officials listened intently, their expressions growing grimmer with each passing moment. It was clear that the evidence was even more damning than they had anticipated. When the presentation was over, one of the senior agents spoke up, his voice heavy with the gravity of the situation. "This is unprecedented. The scale of this conspiracy. It goes to the very top. We'll need to launch a full-scale investigation, but we must be extremely careful. If even a hint of this leaks, it could spark a crisis." Senator Grant nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll keep it contained until we're ready to move. But make no mistake, when the time comes, we'll need to strike hard and fast. We cannot allow these people to escape justice." The officials agreed, and plans were set in motion. A task force was assembled, evidence was secured, and preparations were made for a series of coordinated raids that would take place across the country. It was an operation unlike any other, a sweeping crackdown on corruption and abuse of power that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of government and business. For Sarah and Michael, the days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. They were debriefed, protected, and kept informed of the progress being made. The evidence they had provided was meticulously reviewed, and the case against the conspirators grew stronger by the day. But with each step forward, the risks increased. The people they were up against were powerful, ruthless, and they would do anything to protect themselves. Then, finally, the day of reckoning arrived. It began with a series of early morning raids, carried out simultaneously in multiple cities. High-profile arrests were made, and the news spread like wildfire. The media was in a frenzy as the names of the arrested individuals, people who had been thought untouchable, flashed across screens and front pages. The country was in shock as the full extent of the conspiracy was revealed. Sarah and Michael watched it all unfold from a secure location, surrounded by agents who ensured their safety. It was surreal, seeing the men who had hunted them, who had tried to destroy their lives, being led away in handcuffs. The weight of it all pressed down on them, the realization that they had not only survived but had helped bring about a moment of true justice. Senator Grant was at the forefront of the media coverage, her calm and authoritative presence reassuring a nation that was grappling with the enormity of what had been uncovered. She spoke of the courage it had taken for people like Sarah and Michael to come forward, to stand up against corruption even when the odds were stacked against them. Her words resonated deeply, not just with the public, but with Sarah and Michael as well. In the days that followed, the fallout continued. More arrests were made, more evidence was uncovered, and the investigation expanded. It was clear that this was just the beginning of a long and arduous process of rooting out the corruption that had festered for so long. But there was hope now, hope that real change was possible. For Sarah and Michael, the end of the nightmare brought with it a sense of peace they hadn't felt in a long time. They had been through hell, but they had come out the other side stronger, closer, and with a renewed sense of purpose. The danger had not completely passed, but they no longer had to run, to hide in the shadows. They could finally begin to rebuild their lives. One afternoon, as they walked through a quiet park, one of the few moments of normalcy they had allowed themselves, Michael turned to Sarah, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "What now, Sarah? What do we do with our lives now that all of this is over?" Sarah smiled, the weight of the past few months lifting as she looked at her brother. "We start over. We take everything we've learned, everything we've been through, and we use it to make a difference. We're not the same people we were before, Michael. We've seen the worst of what the world has to offer, but we've also seen that there's still good, still people willing to fight for what's right." Michael nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "I like that. A new beginning." As they continued to walk, the sun breaking through the clouds to warm their faces, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think about the future, not with fear, but with hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, and now they had the chance to build something new, something better. And as they walked through the park, the past behind them and the future stretching out before them, Sarah knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The shadows that had once loomed so large had finally begun to fade, replaced by the promise of a new dawn.